folks. Welcome to another episode of the Fabricators Coach Podcast. I'm your host, Ed Young. As you know, I've worked with hundreds of folks who own and run their own businesses, both in this industry and others. And when I talk with them, I frequently get into discussion about what their exit strategy looks like, when do they plan to leave the business, how, what does that whole scenario look like? And as a result, I get a lot of questions about what's involved in the process of selling a business. And while I have been around a lot of these, around several sales, and while I've been involved in a few of them, I'm not the expert that can answer all those questions. So what I've decided to do is put together a series of podcasts about this. In the first few podcasts, we're going to talk to a Fab Shop owner who owned his shop for a while and sold it recently. So we'll talk about his personal experience. And in the next few episodes after that, we're going to talk to a professional business broker who grew up a bit in the stone industry. So he's got kind of both of those experiences. I want to show the process of selling the business both from the owner's point of view and also some technical information from a broker's point of view. The whole idea is to, as you start putting together your plans for eventually exiting your business, helping you figure out how to get ready for that. What's that process look like, and what are some things you maybe need to know? In this first series, the Fab Shop owner I'm going to talk to is somebody who hopefully you already know. His name is Aaron Crowley. Aaron he got into the business when he was 17 years old. He eventually started up his own shop, ran it for around 20 years, and then he just recently sold that shop. So you may know Aaron from his very well-known Fab Lab podcast. And if not, you probably know him as the inventor of the no-lift install cart. And so as what typically happens with Aaron, when he and I get talking, it's tough to stay structured. We really get into a lot of different aspects of any topic that we're in. So these episodes with him won't be that structured. But in general, in the first one, we're going to talk about kind of what his experience was going through selling the business. In the second episode, we're going to talk about how he handled his employees during that sales process so that they were comfortable staying on with the new owner, which is a big thing a lot of folks don't think about. The third episode, we're going to talk more about how to get prepared for the process and some more details around it, plus some takeaways that kind of after the fact, after the sale. So I think they're really, really good information for Fab Shop owners. And as I said, these conversations with Aaron are not highly structured. So what we're going to do is we're just going to join that conversation in process. Appreciate that. I think really my main purpose is to get folks thinking about the reality of selling their business. Why would you want to sell? What do you need to get out of it financially? What's your business really worth? What's the process like? When do you start getting ready for that? All those kind of things. What is it that impacts the value of your business? We talked about that from time to time. So I think it's just kind of wrapping all this up from a former Fab Shop owner's perspective, what that process looks like. I'm going to be talking with Chase and interviewing him from a broker's perspective. What do they wish sellers knew about the process, and kind of getting into those details. And we're going to do 2 or 3 episodes there, I think.
Okay.
So I'm just trying to get folks thinking about this and ready for it to some degree.
So that maybe we can work this in, since you're going to be talking to a broker. One of the points I make in the financial, just being diligent in maintaining good financials, is that the buyer is the least of the important people in that equation. You have to convince the broker, and more importantly, you have to convince the bank that this is a good investment, because they're not going to lend the money on something that looks iffy or questionable.
Yeah.
And the broker's the same way. He's looking at your numbers going, is this legit? Or I smell a rat here, and those brokers are looking at these numbers every day. So you think you're going to pull a fast one on one of those two parties, and you might be able to hoodwink the buyer because he's so excited. You are not going to be able to hoodwink those other two.
Yeah.
stakeholders in this equation. And so so that was bank, broker, and buyer were the three people you got to convince with your
Okay.
financials.
Gotcha.
To the extent that maybe feeds into your conversation with Chase.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, he'll well, let's talk about it in our conversation with you too, because you lived it. Okay. And then I'm sure as we get into valuation, but I think what you've got to say will carry a lot more weight because you've been through the process. That's the key. So Chase, I think, just offers an additional perspective that's good for folks to understand. So just trying to just trying to help folks out. Okay. Is that integrated in the form of part of the exit strategy?
Yeah, in terms of the motivation, and I think that in looking back, I think having there's two things going on there. Number one, I was realizing we know it was growing to the point we had to put that robot in, and I didn't have room in my shop, and so it was like, crap, we got to go lease a building. There was no real estate available, so the place we found was an hour away. And then my business partner drops this bombshell on me: I'm retiring. I'm like, fantastic. Yeah, I got two businesses an hour away from each other. That just sounds like hell on earth. I already don't like doing this, and that was like kind of really the impetus. Like, this is just not the life I want to live. I am not willing, if I can alter the circumstances, I do not want to be in that position from a quality of life standpoint. And so that was really the driving sort of catalyst to go, okay, I got to get out of the countertop shop because I've done that, been there, I'm done.
Okay, so No Lift wasn't really wasn't necessarily part of an exit strategy, and selling your business, there wasn't necessarily an exit strategy per se, although you had thought about that earlier, right?
Oh yeah. But had I not had something else to go to, the transaction, the timeline would have looked very different for me. So because the way I looked at it, No Lift appeared to me at the time to be a much bigger opportunity. And it's like, I can do two things poorly, or I can just fully invest myself in one thing that I believe has a lot more potential upside.
Right.
And so I looked at Crowley's as like, the sooner I get whatever my cost of exit is, that's freeing me up to go do something where my time is much better spent. Where if it was just like, hey, I'm just ready to retire, I couldn't have sold Crowley's for what I sold it for in the timeline. It would have looked very different. So I had a unique set of circumstances. So that's one of my other, I guess, recommendations to people is you need to be thinking about what you're going to do next. And whereas I think a lot of times the desire for relief, just temporary relief from the pressure cooker scenario is like so appealing. It's just like, I don't care what, I just need a break. But man, you want that break, and you get to the edge of the cliff, and now it's like, pull the trigger. I don't know what I'm going to do next.
Yeah.
And so I think that's, to me, thinking about what you're going to do next and having that as a part of your strategy from the get-go is really important. Mine was more circumstantial, and I just found myself in that situation. It wasn't part of a plan.
Yeah.
But I think, if you don't have that, and I've heard other people say that it's not uncommon. I don't want to say if it's pretty common. It's not uncommon for sellers of their business to get to the edge of a transaction and back out at the last second.
Yeah. I've heard a lot of stories about that myself.
Yeah. So
people do that because they really haven't.
And I can elaborate on some of that, and
well, I think the whole issue of having a plan for selling your business, I think is an important topic to discuss. Yours was a little more situational, but having been through the actual transaction and that whole long drawn out process, which is more like buying a house than it is more like buying a car or selling a house, selling a car. It's a long process. People obviously have got all their own motivations for getting rid of a business, and I've talked to plenty of them that, like you said, they just wanted relief. They just give me some money, give me out, and I'm not just in this industry, but in others. when you're running a business that's $1, $2, $3, $4 million a year in sales, and you're doing it pretty much by yourself as the head person, that's a huge stress. Even if you're making money, it's tough to do. And I've seen both. So everybody's got their own motivation for making a sale. But you were talking about people getting to that cliff of almost closing the transaction, and then the seller backs out. What do you think it is that causes them to back out?
Well, my guess is it's a variety of things, but the first couple things that come to mind is number one, if someone's been in that role and they've been doing something productive, they've been engaged in the the battle, and there's a lot of adrenaline that comes along with that. I think that's part of it. It's like, what am I actually going to do with myself? As much as the relief sounds good, so that I'm imagining that's a part of it. The other part is, if you don't have a secondary plan, unless you're selling your company for, just massive, just a huge, the tax hit you're going to pay is going to be, capital gains. Now in Oregon, you add to that the state income tax. So for me, it was 31% on the gain.
Holy smokes.
Yeah. You take that out of it. In my case, it was the attorney. I didn't have a broker that managed the transaction, but I had an attorney involved, and it was probably about, at the end of the day, was probably about the same amount. So you start chipping away at that, and you're like, okay, so how long can I be idle before I have to go back, before I have to go to work doing something? Okay. And so then now you're on the cliff, and it's like do or die. And that it maybe is the first time you've really been forced to consider the reality of, okay, now I've got a non-compete, so I can't go back to what I know how to do. I got to go figure out something else to do when the money runs out, and it's gonna run out faster than you think. And my guess is that's probably a combination of those two things, are probably why someone would be like, man, maybe this isn't so bad. I'll give it another couple of years. But I'm speculating, because I had something I was moving to.
Yeah, I think you're right. I've talked with some folks who've been on both sides of those transactions where they got, to the final hour and then stopped the whole process. And I think what you're talking about is pretty well spot on. They just really haven't thought about, part of it, especially for a male, our identity is tied up in what we do for a living. Well, as you know, having been currently being a business owner, having been a former Fab Shop owner, it defines a whole lot of who you are. Because it's not just a job. It's, you built it from scratch, and it really is a big definition of who Aaron Crowley is. And so you lose that. It's like, all right, now who am I? What do I do? Not just what I do for what's that? How do I see myself anymore?
Yeah, I think that I would agree 100% hearing you say that where once again, my situation was unique, and that I was still going to be very much engaged in the industry that I'd spent the previous 25, 30 years.
Right.
And so I didn't necessarily have to confront losing that. Whereas if it had just been like, okay, I'm done, I'm out of the industry, I'm out of the business, I think that's huge. Yeah. I think that's a huge part of it.
Yeah. And that's part of what I do. And I work with clients, the core of what I do is change management, helping a client understand, okay, what's the nature of your problem? What's the root cause? What needs to change to fix the problem? How do we cause that change to happen? And that's where things a lot of times get hung up, is on the execution side. Then understanding, getting out there, making things happen. I think that's a big key to this now. But yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, some of those making changes in your business before you're ready to sell, and contemplating some of these realities, before you get to the point of like, man, I gotta get out of this. Yeah. And I know and most of us don't want to admit that. There was definitely an aspect of that for me too. I'd been through the Great Recession. I'd hired a GM to come in and run the company, and that had went really well until it went really terrible. And I was wore out from that, doing it again. It was like 2 turnarounds on the company, both of them self-inflicted. But I was tired, and ready for a change. And so, but I think to your point about the change management, and as it relates to this conversation, the the way in which you find yourself at that cliff, either, hey, I got here because of a plan, I made changes in the business so that when I got to this point, I was ready, versus I'm to the point where I have to do something different because the status quo is just, I just don't got any more gas left in the tank. And I think that's the huge defining difference in terms of how much you get for the business and how that experience goes once you sell it.
Yeah, I think you're talking about part of it is just the difference between having a plan, what is your exit strategy, what's your plan to make that happen, versus all of a sudden I'm being forced into it because of health issues or something else. Certainly. I hadn't thought about that's a really good point, and it really has an impact on what's your business worth, because if you've prepared it for sale, it has a bigger impact. Your business is probably going to be a lot more valuable than if all of a sudden you have to sell because you got a bad health report or something.
Those factors that kind of play into that valuation, it's an interesting kind of give and take where there are variables that the buyer is going to look at. One of them is going to be profitability. Your EBITDA, or a multiple of the EBITDA, is one of the ways that they establish at least a baseline value for the business. And so there's this catch-22 where if you're running that business full tilt, but you are the central cog in the wheel or the hub that keeps it all together, you may be picking up the income, because in another business you need 2 additional managers to fill your role, which I think is not uncommon. I think an owner operating at that level, you literally have to hire 2 people to replace an owner because of what they bring to the table. And so the buyer's looking at this going, hey, the EBITDA is great, but once you're out of the picture, who steps in to fill that role? And is it the new buyer? Or is he buying, he's buying the standalone business that he hopes to continue to produce those results? And that's another part of this planning that you're talking about, and being willing to change. It's a give and take. You can maximize one, but that actually ends up hamstringing you, because certain buyers are not looking to come in and work 80 hours a week. Some buyers are looking to acquire a business as an investment that they can manage from a distance, or even manage maybe not from too far of a distance. And so that's gonna cut into the valuation in terms of what's that transition look like, and who do they have to hire, and what do they have to pay them to step in and replace you? Yeah. And that I think comes back to your original point about being willing to change in advance of this day of wanting to sell it.
Yeah, there's so many aspects to what you just said, because there's the aspect of, okay, buyers many times are much more educated on this whole process than sellers are, especially a seller that hasn't prepared, that's all of a sudden having to sell. Then there's the issue of getting ready to sell. What does that number look like, and how do you influence the value of the business? What I like to do with clients, and this is part of that change management discussion, is help them think through what their exit strategy may be in terms of, what do you want to do when you're not doing this anymore? And try to help them develop that picture of what's, what that in looks like, what that pot of gold's in the rainbow, or that brass ring, whatever it is for them. And then figure out, okay, so you love to play golf. You want to play the great golf courses of the world. Great. Let's list them. What are the green fees at St. Andrews? What's it cost to go there and stay? You start to put a dollar figure around that vision. And so once you figure out, okay, in order to do all these things I want to do, travel where I want to go, whatever, this is the kind of money I got to have. That means when your business cashes out, that's what you want to end up with additional in your savings account, so to speak. And then you got to figure out, okay, so how do I get my business to the point it's worth that? By the way, what's it worth today? This is a discussion I have with clients a lot, is, all right, that's where you want to end up with. That means your business, when you sell it, has got to give you $3 million in cash, or whatever the number is. So if you were to sell your business today, how close to 3 million are you? And when we start having a discussion around what drives the value of the business, that's when you realize, okay, we're at this level. This business was going to, instead of 3 million, it's probably going to turn out 300,000 today. I got to get it to 3 million. How do we do that? That's part of that change management, because now we have a direction. We have a goal to go for. We've set a timeline. I want to do this in 5 years, the owner says, or I want to do this in 10 years. Now we got a timeline. And we also have some metric we can start to track in the process. And if the owner really wants to achieve whatever that post stone business ownership vision is, if they really want to achieve that, now we've got motivation for the change management aspect.
Yeah.
That works out.
Yeah,
well.
like you said, you got a target to work towards, as opposed to, because even if, just changing for the sake of change, if you've got a nice business that's making money, now may not have a multiple that gets you to this fantasy, cash out day.
Yep.
But if you don't have that as your driving motivation, man, I mean, just for no other reason, just to, hey, well, let's just take it upon ourselves to suffer all of the pain that change forces upon us in that transition, without that end goal established and that clear reason why we're going to pursue that. Yeah, you're probably not going to change. You're
exactly
going to just continue. And I guess running a fab shop in particular, hard enough as it is. I mean, it's not like it's a cakewalk until you decide to change. It's a tough business.
Yeah, no, it's definitely challenging. No question about that. I think too, when you look at the change management aspect, you're going from a business that may generate $300,000 in cash for a sale today, and you want to change it to something that generates $3 million cash 5 years from now. That's two totally different types of businesses. You can't continue doing what got you here is not necessarily going to take you to where you need to go. You got to be willing to adapt a lot. I like to use the example of Jobs and Wozniak, Apple Computer, two guys working in a garage. Neither one of them are really good at running a business. So early on, and there's actually, Jobs' biography that came out recently kind of goes through this process. They went through a series of general managers, of people running the business, because they knew they had to have somebody else running the business while they did all the product development, the marketing, and all the rest of it, because they knew what their core was, what they were good at. They knew they weren't good at everything. And I think that's one of the challenges that shop owners have for say a $2 to $4 million size business, especially. They feel like they've got to be really good at everything, and very few people truly are.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and then you look at the scale of that, and if you're using those proportions, what we were, just as a baseline sort of data point, the broker that did the valuation, they did a very thorough valuation of our business about almost a year before the opportunity to sell came up. So I had that valuation I think it's down here in my box. It's right there. I mean, it was in a full on, very official, bound the whole 9 yards. He said that from their experience, the multiple, sort of that standardized way of looking at EBITDA and then running it through the stone industry, they considered to be riskier than the average, and so they used a 2.5 to 2.8 multiplier on EBITDA. And
wow.
Now that was one broker, one valuation, whether that's reflective of everybody else. But let's just round it up to 3. So to sell your business for $3 million, you gotta have $1 million in verified, income. Okay, so let's just back that out a little bit further. So let's just say you got a 10% profit margin. That means your business has got to be doing 10 million in sales, and if you're right now doing 4, your business has to be 2.5 times larger than it is today. And to your point about what it takes to make that leap from whatever the number I said, 4 to 10. I mean, that's so, and I think that's really, it's jarring as an owner when you get the valuation and you realize, wow, man, this is not worth near as much as I thought it was, considering how much effort I put into this over the last 20 years.
Yeah.
And then it's important that you come to grips with reality to say so let's just reality-based, planning. We got to be at 10, the business has got to be at 10 million, and that's got to be producing this income to be at that number. And to know that in advance, I think, is so healthy, because I think we as owners tend to value the business based on our investment in it, and we overvalue it. I mean, that's it. And brokers will tell you that. They'll tell you that every time, that every business owner thinks their business is worth more than it actually is.
And I can back that up. I've worked with dozens and dozens of Fab Shop owners and worked with literally hundreds of other companies that are, owner operated and in this size and larger, and some even smaller. And that's always true. And every time I sit down and have just a rough, not a rough, but a kind of a not accurate, but an estimated type conversation about what the business is probably worth, the people have actually come to tears because they realize all of a sudden, wait a minute, I think this $5 million business is worth $10 million. No, it's actually worth about 500,000, maybe, or a million or something, depending on the stats. And so just understanding what drives that. And you threw a few concepts out there real quick. I want to go back and kind of cover. We talked about EBITDA and multiples, and those are two of the big drivers. What essentially is EBITDA?
Let's see here if I can. I threw that out there. Earnings before depreciation and interest. Is that? Am I missing?
It's interest, depreciation, taxes, and amortization. I think is the acronym. It's roughly equated to net profit of the business. If you got $1 million, if you've got a $5 million business and you're doing a profit of $250,000 a year, that's a 5% profit. And your EBITDA is going to be somewhere in that $250,000 a year range, depending on taxes, depreciation, a few other things.
Yeah,
fair enough.
But it's a standardized way of looking at apples to apples from business to business, where you're looking at the P&L and you're backing out interest, you're backing out, because you take a bunch of depreciation on a piece of equipment, take it all in 1 year, and you show zero income. They're gonna factor that in. They're gonna go, okay, well, we know you didn't make zero last year. You wrote this off, and so we're gonna add that back. But it's an accurate way of forecasting the cash that the enterprise actually generates in its average operation, and then they take they'll back out. Hey, you got 4 vacations in here last year. Okay, well, that somehow you managed to write that off. We'll add that back. They are interested in realizing how much, after the bills have been paid, how much cash is actually left over in the operation, so that they can determine, can this thing even pay the loan that the buyer's going to need to buy the business.
So we've got a standardized way of calculating a profitability measure for the business. And that's both important for the buyer. It's also important because when you've got this documentation you've got to pull together for a business, you got to not just convince the buyer that it's worth this amount of money. Who else has got to be convinced that it's worth that money?
Yeah, well, if the buyers, like most buyers, they're going to a bank. Someone's loaning the money. A lot of people aren't walking around with $2 or $3 million to buy a Fab Shop. Maybe there's a few. That was not the case in my, sale. And I mean, you want to talk about, not to be too crass, pulling your pants down. I mean, everything is exposed in that process, and the bank, the broker is going to definitely have his view. He's going to want to have access to all those numbers so that they can help come up with the valuation, because he doesn't want to. It's just like you mentioned, real estate. Broker is going to come in here and go, I got a pretty good sense. I do this for a living. Let me look at your numbers. This is what this is worth. I know what buyers are looking for. Same thing. A real estate agent's going to go, man, you're just we can list it for that, but you're never going to sell it because here's what the comps show. Yeah. So the broker, he wants access to that information so he can make a legitimate valuation to take to his buyer pool. But the bank is going to be the ones that are really interested, because they're the ones loaning the money, and they're going to take. It's going to be a very uncomfortable. There is no hiding anything in that process. They're going to be asking a lot of questions. And that's when, so part of this, this conversation about, well, that answers that question. I guess I was gonna go down a rabbit trail of what it means to maintain good books today. If you're thinking about selling 3 years from now, I think there's two common, and you could probably verify this and call me out if this isn't true. I mean, I'm happy to be corrected. I've just heard this from guys that loan money on equipment, that how many fab shops really aren't operating on financial statements? They're not doing accounting. They're running the business from a checkbook.
Yeah.
And so if all of a sudden you find yourself trying to tell a broker, hey, I want to sell my business, well, let's look at the financials, and your financials either don't exist or they're ridiculously incomplete.
Yep.
One of two things is going to happen. They're going to be like, this is a joke. I mean, as soon as the bank or the, anybody looks at this, the buyer's going to want to know, what, have you made money? You're telling me I'm supposed to just take your word for it? Now you got to have legit books that you can provide them. And so if you don't, and let's just say hypothetically, you got a buyer, all of a sudden your dream buyer shows up. And the first question he's going to ask is, well, I want to see a P&L and a balance sheet for the last 3 years, and then I want to see your tax returns. Yep. If all of a sudden you've got to go recreate that, if your books are tight, it's going to be a challenge to provide that information. If your books are not tight, it is going to be an undertaking of almost inconceivable just work to pull that together and to present it in a manner that is acceptable to a broker and a bank.
And so I think even then, in that kind of situation, the results are going to be questioned, because if your books are not tight, you don't have documentation, you can't back up what you're putting in those statements. So I think the bottom line is you really have to prepare for selling a business. We talked about EBITDA, we talked about multiples, and I think in the discussion of what drives the multiple, you used a 3 a minute ago. I've heard some different numbers, so we can talk about that. But there's several things that drive the multiple. One is the documentation and the proof of what the track record for the business has been, and then there's you talked about cog in the wheel. I use the terminology, the long pole in the tent is if you pull the owner out of the business, does the tent collapse kind of thing. So those two, because is your buyer trying to buy a cash flow, or do they want to buy a job? If they want to buy a job and the owner's a long pole in the tent, not too bad a deal. But if the buyer's trying to buy cash flow and the business doesn't run without the owner, we got a problem. So you've got both the preparation of the business, and then you get the preparation and the ongoing aspect of all the documentation. Mm-hmm. So you were kind of talking about documentation and what's needed and how far back, and you got to have it for the banker, for the broker, and for the buyer. Have all got to understand all that. You mentioned P&Ls, you mentioned balance sheets. What other kind of documentation are they? I think you ran into some pretty interesting circumstances in your situation that were not always common, but could be a little more common these days.
Yeah. So, tax returns. So they wanted 3 years of profit and loss, 3 years of tax returns. And that's where they're going to be able, the folks that are looking at those financial documents for a living, they start sniffing out inconsistencies, and so that's how they go in and do their due diligence and that's where that multiple is going to come in. If they're like, yeah, this looks like a pretty good business, but we're going to hedge a little bit here. I mean, we're not willing to lend on that full amount because we got to pad the risk a little bit, because we feel these books may be a little bit suspect. I'm speculating that's how that conversation goes. Yeah. But that's what they asked for 3 years back. And in my case, they asked, the bank also wanted forecasts going forward. So I was also showing even more detailed level information in terms of like number of jobs, the breakdown between retail and contractor business. So they were asking really good questions. And where you're talking about documentation and the financial statements, thankfully we had, we would detail that in our in our profit and loss statement or the income statement. We broke down because we wanted to know, what's the mix of business that we're doing, or what's the mix of business that we did, and how does that factor into profitability? And I'm sure there was more information than that. Those were the primary.
Didn't you have some circumstances with some buildings, and was there SBA loan or?
Oh yeah. So we had there were other things. Yeah, I'd forgotten about that. So we owned the building. And so whether you lease the building or own the building, that's going to become a factor in the decision, because and I think in particular with the Fab Shop, where you got so much invested in that space in terms of electrical, plumbing, drainage, the equipment set up in there, and the cost of moving a Fab Shop is so ridiculously expensive. They want to know that that lease is secure, and so there's this handoff between the landlord, if it's a landlord situation. In my case, we had to agree to a 10-year lease. That was what the bank required.
Wow.
For them to loan them. They wanted to know that the new owner had that security built in, that they weren't going to lose the lease and have $150,000 moving expense 5 years from now.
Yeah.
I don't know that I ever was told what the term of the loan was.
Right.
But that was a part of it, is like, hey,
Wow.
so then we had to go and as a landlord, that became part of the transaction. That was a separate transaction, doing all the okay. It just came to me. I knew there was a gigantic element to this data that comes into that transaction. But anyway, the lease, we had to have that in place. And for us, one of the things that we were not anticipating, so the SBA loan that I had for buying the building when we had purchased that, stipulated that I could not, let's see, how was that worded? I had to occupy as the owner of the countertop company, because that was what justified the purchase.
Right.
I had to occupy 51% of that building. And so all of a sudden, this entire business sale hinged on whether or not I could go back out and get a conventional loan on the building. And that was an unforeseen detail that created a massive amount of work and stress in the middle of still trying to run the business.
Yeah.
And for a good period of time, this was all going on, and none of my employees had any idea that this was underway. And so you've got to run the business. I got all this stuff. The bank's breathing down my neck. The buyer's breathing down my neck. They're wanting to come take tours of my shop, and people are asking who's those random people walking around, the showroom and the shop last night.
Yeah.
And then you've got things like this that you just can't anticipate. And there's probably other things that, in other situations where that factor into this. In my case, the loan that the buyer was getting to purchase the business. But the thing I was going to mention that just came to mind was the way that the work in process was valued. And so long in advance, they're asked, where this conversation comes up. So we're going to buy this. It's a very interesting it is a rabbit trail, but it's fascinating. And I think why it's relevant was the amount of work that went into actually coming up with this number that we had to provide at closing. It not to be underestimated, the amount of additional work that goes into selling the business while you're running it. It was many times as onerous and just reality as I would have ever believed it could have been. And so we had to provide a template in advance of this. So there's going to be this closing date, right? We're going to, just like you buy a house, and on that day, they're going to calculate the taxes that the original owner, would have had to have paid up to that point. And then you're going to pay those, and it's in the middle of the month. So there's that calculation. Well, the same thing was true. We got this business running, and I got all these jobs that have been sold, that have been contracted. Some of them haven't been started yet, but I've got deposits on all those jobs, and I got contracts for them. Then I got jobs that I've templated. So I've invested some of my labor, but that's going to be installed, and the new owner of the business is going to actually collect on that when it sells. And so you've got all these jobs at various stages of production that have to be somehow valued on that day when you close. And the list so that was two different things. That was a work in progress that we had to evaluate, and then we had to prove, and then we had to actually go back and change all of our contracts, because our contracts did not, it's really interesting. Those people contracted with my company to do that job and wrote me a check, and I put that in the bank. Now I had to account for that in closing, but we had to go back and essentially explain to people, hey, oh, by the way, we're in the process of selling the business, and we need to get your permission to, in this handoff, And so we immediately changed the terms of our contract so that anything that was sold going forward, we didn't have to go do that for. But there were jobs that required that level of to be legal, and because you're going to, it's a legal process at closing. You're in a title company, you're at the escrow office with an escrow agent, and man, the other part of it is all of the loans that you've gotten. And if you need to stop me if I'm just going completely off the rails here, down this rabbit trail, but it's coming back to me now. The
I can, because I've got the video and our listeners won't have it. I'm watching the flashbacks going across Aaron's face from time to time as he's re-experiencing all this. But this all goes back, I think, to having somebody that helps you navigate the process, because it's obviously much more complex than selling a house, selling a car, anything like that. There's a lot involved, and because this is, as part of its core, kind of a manufacturing business where you've got sequential process steps that add value to the product, and at some point you're gonna draw a line in the sand. That's the end of the existing business, the beginning of the new one. What is each of them owed or owe each other, and figuring out all those details is something people just don't think about. That's a lot of additional, as you're talking about, additional paperwork and preparation, and get everybody to agree that, yeah, this is a valid number.
Yeah, and you're right. And we had to come up with that template in advance and say, well, here's what we think, and here's how we think we should value this. What do you think? Well, we'll take that back to our attorney and broker, and we'll get back to you and tell you what we think is, and that's, one of many, elements of that. And the other thing was that just came to mind, where there's no funny business possible, because if you've got loans, for example, like we had just bought a new piece of equipment that was not paid off yet.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, you can't just, that's not assumable. You can't just lump that in. You've got to go back and show payoff dates. You've got to go to your lenders. They got to tell you what the payoff is on the day of closing.
Right. Yeah.
And they've got to agree, and so it's just, and if you've got, a loan on a couple of truck payments, and you got a couple pieces of equipment you're still paying on, all of a sudden you're going back and it's like, I haven't thought about that lender since, we bought the piece of equipment. We've just been writing checks ever since. And now all of a sudden we got to go get this documentation and provide that.
Yeah.
And
so part of, we talked about multiples a while back, EBITDA and multiples, and the way those are used is to value a business, you figure out that standard measure of profitability, EBITDA, and then you multiply it by a number. And you said that your information was like 2.5 to 3 as the multiple. I've got a friend of mine who's a CPA who actually ran a Fab Shop for a few years, and he says that, at least in the Southeast, that multiple runs something like 3 to 6, depending. And one of the things that impacts, somebody has to make a decision on the multiple. And one of the things that impacts the decision on the multiple is how tight are your processes? How good a documentation do you have? Is it clear? Is it backed up? Do your P&Ls and balance sheets jive with your tax returns and your bank accounts? Does all that make sense?
Yeah, there are, and that was another bit of information. We had to provide the head count. I mean, I had to write up a summary of every employee in the company, how long they'd worked for the company, what did they make, what were their job duties. Yeah. And if you think, you got 20 employees, it's like, well, that's a day's work right there. That's a day. I mean, by the time I think through all that and get all that information together and put it into a format where I can provide it. But again, they want to know, okay, you can say the business runs on its own, but I want to know who on this org chart is running the business when you're not here. And you gotta support that.
It's also kind of not that I intended to do this, but I'm sitting here looking at my bookcase, and to just do a shameless plug, your book, Less Chaos, More Cash, right, is all about pulling that documentation together and making that part of how you run your business anyway. And I think we both agree that a company, a Fab Shop that followed that formula and did the type of documentation that you advocate in the book, I think that's something that enhances the multiple, isn't it?
For sure. Yeah. And as I've, kind of delved further into this, kind of discipline of business sales and M&A and that kind of stuff, and just been a little more interested in it. Yeah, that is a huge variable in terms of the value of a company. And it really comes back to what you said. If you got a guy out there he wants to pay millions of dollars for a job. I mean, I think those guys actually do exist. So that's not to say that they don't. They're probably the exception to the rule. But more than likely, you've got somebody who's buying a business that they kind of hope they can maybe optimize it, take what's there and expand it or build on it. But yeah, they're looking for a seasoned management team, processes in place, a method in terms of how the business works, especially if you've got somebody from outside the industry that's coming in. It's like, I don't know any of the technical stuff here, but I can run the business. Is there a business here to run?
Yeah.
And yeah, those processes and that your management team are hugely valuable to certain buyers, and maybe even deal breakers for some, because they're truly looking for a business to run or to own, not run.
Yeah, they want to own it. They want to have to make the big heavy decisions, and then they're basically buying cash flow.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
But that's how that all kind of boils down to it.
So as you can tell from that conversation, as I mentioned ahead of time, it's not highly structured, but we covered a lot of good information. Hopefully that's helpful for you. And again, our next episode is going to be a little bit shorter, and we're going to talk about how he handled his employees, how he introduced them to the new owner, and how he was able to keep his employees comfortable with the process and the transition, so that the new owner was able to keep that expertise and that experience and keep the continuity of the business. So look for our next episode shortly.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Fabricators Coach Podcast. If you got any additional questions about this particular episode or anything else, please check us out at fabricatorscoach.com. Thanks.